On the 6th of March 1945, a flight of Bf-109Gs took off from Proust Airfield just south of Gdansk. The weather was foul, but the Soviets were threatening to make a breakthrough and the meagre force of Messerschmitts was needed to try and dissuade their assault aircraft. Visibility in the snowstorm was poor, and the flight spotted nothing on their sweep. On the way home, one of the inexperienced flyers became separated from his flight. Lost and short on fuel, he had no choice but to put down in a field. In the distance, he could hear the rumble of artillery fire. His shoulder hurt like hell where he'd smashed it against the cockpit side when the landing gear collapsed. It was bitterly cold. Fear began to push through the pain and adrenaline. This was probably it. Then, just faintly over the bang of falling shells, he heard a strange noise. Whoomp, whoomp, whoomp it went. A curious machine appeared over the trees lining the field. The pilot gripped his Luger with his good hand as the spindly craft circled and then headed down towards him. As it did so, he saw the black cross on its side. Moments later, he was dragged up inside the craft and it took off, heading back to Proust. Unknown to this sadly anonymous aviator, he was the first pilot to be rescued by helicopter in Europe, and one of the first all told. His rescuers flew an FA-223 Dragon, arguably the most successful of the three models of helicopter that the German military employed during the Second World War. These aircraft were not deployed in significant numbers, nor did they leave much of a mark on history, but they are nonetheless interesting, as when captured at the end of the war, they and their designers went on to advance the development of helicopters in other countries in the subsequent decade. German engineers had actually started to experiment with rotorcraft before the First World War. Nothing came of these early attempts, and defeat in the Great War led to a moratorium on such tests in the first years after the peace. Inevitably, the Nazis' rise to power led to more interest in the military potential of various types of novel aircraft, though. The main source of innovation in German helicopter design were two men, Anton Flettner and Heinrich Fokker. Flettner was born in 1885 near Frankfurt. He became interested in aviation at the same time as many other intelligent people of the era. In that time around 1905, aviation was a wonder technology that inspired and enthralled. Flettner's early fame actually did not come from aviation, though. In 1914, he patented a new form of steering for a torpedo, and then developed the Flettner rotor as a means to propel ships. In 1932, he finally got around to designing an aircraft. His rather ironically named Gigant was a direct rotor drive machine with 100-foot blades turned by two 30-horsepower Anzani engines. In 1933 and 34, Gigant made a dozen tethered flights before it was destroyed when a strong gust of wind turned it over during a free hovering trial at 20 feet up. 1934 proved a momentous year for German helicopter design, as in December the Reich Air Ministry declared that development of rotorcraft was to be prioritized as they had the potential to revolutionize land and sea warfare. That's a pretty insightful prediction for 1934, and well ahead of strategic planners in other major powers. In 1935 and 36, both Flettner and Fokker concentrated on autogyro production. But early trials with the Kriegsmarine led to them concluding that autogyros wouldn't be much use on ships or submarines. Ever inventive, Flettner then developed a system of intermeshing rotors, creating something more recognizable as a helicopter. His design placed two two-bladed rotors close together, but angled so that they could spin without the blades colliding. This wasn't actually a new idea. It had been patented in 1902 by Max Boucher, but had until that point defied practical application. The FL-265 was a very small aircraft. It was only 20 feet and 3 inches long, weighed 1,700 pounds empty and 2,200 pounds at full load. Pilots were instructed to skip lunch before flying it. Power came from a fan-assisted 160 horsepower 7-cylinder Brahmo radial driving a pair of 40-foot rotors. The prominent fan is a distinguishing feature of the design, which is very obviously an evolution of Flettner's early autogyros. It didn't provide any motive power, but served to cool the engine, particularly when the aircraft was hovering. Initially, the fan had 3 blades, but Flettner changed it to a 6-blade design later. The Kriegsmarine ordered 6 FL-265s and they began free flight testing in May 1939. An example was demonstrated to Hitler and Goering on the 3rd of July, a display that included a 5-minute hover that earned its pilot 1,000 Reichsmarks from Flettner. The 265 could get up to about 90 miles an hour and climb to 13,500 feet. Its major flaw was the inability to auto-rotate, due to the lack of coupling in the power system and the manual pitch controls. This flaw was cured in the second prototype. Perlier, Flettner's lead pilot, demonstrated this in an unpowered landing using auto-rotation in August 1940. Unfortunately, the original 265 was lost when its gearbox overheated and the pilot failed to land it fast enough. The helicopter's rotors folded up as the revs dropped and it crashed from 100 feet. Tests with Kriegsmarine warships began in the summer of 1939. They included landings on a 16-foot by 16-foot platform on one of the cruiser Koln's gun turrets and on a U-boat. The remaining 5 265s then participated in exercises with a Königsberg-class light cruiser while it was underway. Success in the Navy trials led to interest from the Army. The 265 proved capable of lifting a 225-kilogram mountain gun in a sling dangling from the fuselage. It then successfully evaded 20 minutes of attacks from a Bf-109, intended to test these helicopters' survivability. Overall, the FL-265 prototypes made nearly 1,200 takeoffs and landings and flew for over 126 hours. But despite their success, no more were manufactured. Flettner had quickly realised that he had compromised the 265 by designing it with too many auto-gyro features, particularly in terms of the engine location. He went back to a clean sheet of paper and emerged with the FL-282. The 282, nicknamed the Colibri or Hummingbird, had the same intermeshing rotors, this time inclined at 24 degrees to each other. They were 39 feet in diameter and powered by the 7-cylinder Brahmo, which was now located behind the pilot. Colibri was 21.5 feet long and weighed a useful 5% less than the 265 at 1,676 pounds empty and 2,200 fully loaded. The first 5 aircraft, designated 282A, had a welded steel space frame covered with metal panels and a glazed cockpit. Aircraft built thereafter were 282Bs, and they had an unglazed cockpit and plywood skin. The fin and rudder had wooden frames and they were fabric covered on all models. From a pilot's point of view, the 282 was fitted with an automatic system that enabled the blade pitch to instantly change for auto-rotation and had the control system simplified so that the stick now emerged from the floor in front of the pilot rather than hanging down as it did in the 265. Once some stability issues were ironed out, the 282 proved an easier aircraft to fly than its predecessor, although overall performance was essentially the same. As well as being able to go at 90 miles an hour forwards, it could reverse at around 20 miles an hour and sideslip at 12. It was as successful at evading an FW-190 in tests as the 265 had been against a 109, and it was actively dangerous for the fighter pilot to attempt such a manoeuvre if the helicopter got down very low between the trees. Another test was to hover a pilotless Colibri on a tether and then shoot at it with small arms. Despite taking some hits on the rotors, the helicopter proved quite robust and was landed and repaired. The 282's first free flight was in October 1941, and production of a first batch of machines began in 1942. The original intention had been to purchase 1,000 Colibris for the Navy and Army. They could be configured either as single-seat machines with 28 gallons of 87-octane aviation fuel on board, or as a two-seater with an observer and a rear-facing seat behind the engine and only 15 gallons of fuel. Of these aircraft, at least 50 were to be 282U variants with a much shorter tail suitable for storage aboard U-boats. Because Flettner's own enterprise could only make a maximum of 2 aircraft a month, BMW were asked to create an expanded line that could mass-produce the type. This choice would prove less than ideal, as BMW were in demand for so many other essential items that they never focused on the 282. This was all in the future. Following successful testing, a pair of Colibris were sent to the Mediterranean and Aegean in October 1942 to assist in convoy protection. They were based from the mine layer Drac and the auxiliary ship Bulgaria. Trials had suggested that the helicopters were very useful in detecting submarines, even submerged ones, and then using magnesium flares to mark their location for attacks by surface ships. A radio and signal lamp were used to coordinate with the host ship. Mission duration was 2 hours. 2 5-kilogram or 11-pound bombs could be carried instead of flares if needs be. The 2 units in the Mediterranean received good marks for their usability in all sea conditions, but do not appear to have conducted any attacks on Allied submarines. A special deck handling crane used a cable and harness to swing the helicopter aboard when the ship was rolling. For landing at the stern, a halyard was thrown out of the helicopter from a height of about 10 meters. The halyard was then threaded through pulleys and held by hand, which allowed the helicopter to move up and down as the crew pulled on it. This too proved quite effective. Because the rotors could be removed, the helicopters were easy to store, although the lack of properly designed hangars and pads were an obvious impediment to generating large numbers of sorties. Based on the trials, the 1st Kriegsmarine Helicopter Squadron was established in March 1943 at Kiel. Their main role was to train pilots ahead of deployment on board special submarines equipped with hangars. When these were cancelled as the war started to turn against Germany, the squadron was disbanded in June 1944 and the helicopters reassigned to the army. Much of their service history has been lost. Only 24 aircraft were ever built, including the 5 prototypes. A handful were deployed to the Eastern Front as artillery spotters and may have also been used to evacuate high-ranking Nazis as the Red Army advanced. Although it was small and simple-looking, the 282 was probably the most effective and well-designed helicopter of the war. It was compact, reliable, and it offered decent performance. Had it been developed in the UK, then it would have likely been a war-winning weapon for its anti-submarine functionality. But as it was, it's now largely lost to history. Flettner was, of course, not the only genius German designer working on rotorcraft before the war. Heinrich Fokker was born in Bremen in 1890. He was also caught up in the aviation craze, and around 1910 he built a simple canard airplane of steel tubes and bamboo, powered by an 8-horsepower engine, with the help of his brother Wilhelm. Shortly afterwards, while studying at Leibniz University, he met George Wolf, beginning a lifelong friendship. Starting in 1911, they designed and built aircraft, including a flyable monoplane which Wolf flew in 1912. This interrupted their studies at the university, which were further delayed by the outbreak of World War I. After the war, which Wolf served in and Fokker was exempted from for medical reasons, Fokker completed his studies. With Jörg and Wilhelm, he developed aircraft in secret during the early 1920s, incorporating the Fokker-Wolf Company in 1923. After Wolf's death in a crash and the easing of Versailles Treaty restrictions, Fokker-Wolf began building C-19 and C-30 autogyros under license from 1933 in partnership with Gerd and Gelles. Inspired by this experience, Fokker became more serious about the development of true helicopters. And in fact, although his name is most associated with conventional aircraft, the man himself was probably more influential in rotorcraft. In 1934, Fokker constructed a small 12-pound model of a helicopter powered by a tiny 0.7 horsepower 2-stroke engine. This was very successful, and he therefore decided to build a full-scale version. The resultant FW-61 used the body of the FW-44 trainer as its base. 2 side pylons made from tubular steel were grafted on instead of wings. Each supported a lifting rotor powered by the trainer's original 160 horsepower Siemens Bramo engine. Although the location was the same, the engine had an extended crankshaft at the rear of the crankcase, off which was a split gearbox that drove the rotors. The original shaft powered a cooling fan. The technology in the rotor system was licensed from the same Thierve company Fokker licensed his autogyros from. Lateral movements of the stick automatically made differential changes in lift on the rotors. The pedals tilted the rotor discs in opposite directions, and an automatic auto-rotation feature was also included. It was a more sophisticated design than the Flettner, and it flew for the first time on the 26th of June 1936. It was stripped right down for these early flights, but as Fokker gained in confidence, it began to resemble a proper aircraft. Over the coming 2 years, it set a range of records, demonstrating that it was the best interwar helicopter design. Most famously, it flew in the Deutschlandhalle in Berlin in February 1938 with Hannah Reich at the controls. For all of its success, though, the FW-61 was still very obviously an experimental aircraft. Only 2 were built. It was also produced at a difficult time for Professor Fokker himself. In 1936, he was pushed out of the Fokker-Wulf Company by the shareholders, possibly because he was a reluctant Nazi and therefore considered politically unreliable. The party also wanted his factory to build Bf-109s. Fokker's helicopter experiments may well have saved his life, though, or at least saved him from exile. The Reich ministry suggested that he set up a new company to produce helicopters for the military, and he did this with Agellus. The first product of their partnership was the FA-223 Drache, or Dragon. Rather than just a light scout, the Dragon was a proper utility helicopter. And rather than the piddly 160 horsepower Brahmo, the FA-223 was powered by a 1,000 horsepower BMW Fafnir 323D. When completed and ready for flight tests in June 1940, it proved capable of 115 miles an hour flat out. More impressively, maximum takeoff weight was 9,500 pounds and it could lift nearly 2,500. 2 3-bladed wooden rotors were on outrigger pylons. The fuselage was made of steel tubes and was fabric covered. The pilot and navigator sat ahead of the cargo hold, then the fuel tank and the engine were behind them. The aircraft's tail was a curiously orthodox high T like an aeroplane, otherwise it looks quite like a modern helicopter. Controlling it was more or less like a modern helicopter too, although the structure of the cockpit looks more like something out of a stripped-down prototype racing car than a military aircraft. Testing was more or less uneventful, although the first prototype was lost after 115 flights when one of the pylons broke off. The pilot did successfully bail out, although the observer was killed. 100 aircraft were then ordered, but Allied bombing destroyed the factory in June 1942. This destroyed 9 helicopters and the factory machinery. They moved the factory, and then the same thing happened again in July 1943, leaving only 7 helicopters intact. Those aircraft were used as flying cranes in the Netherlands and in other experiments. Here you can see it lifting a crashed Dornier. Another experiment that took place in Austria involved lifting a 2,000-pound mountain gun to a position 9,000 feet above sea level. This operation would usually have taken 20 men 36 hours to complete. After the second factory was destroyed, a new line was established near Tempelhof in Berlin, but by the end of 1944, only 5 Dragons were still airworthy. 3 of them were allocated to a special transport unit alongside 5 Colibris. They were tasked with extracting prominent Nazis from besieged cities. This was an extraordinarily dangerous task with almost zero chance of crew survival. The unit therefore nicknamed themselves the Heaven-Bound Squadron. It was on an aborted sortie to Graudenz that one of the Dragons picked up that downed Bf-109 pilot. That particular helicopter had a rather challenging flight home. As the overland routes were teeming with Soviet troops, they had to take a route over the sea, flying at only 10 meters above the water. 3 or 4 Dragons were captured by the US and British forces at the end of the war. They were successful aircraft and thus they were in demand for study. One had actually flown over 200 hours operationally. One of the aircraft stayed in the UK, where it crashed on a demonstration flight on the 3rd of October 1945. Its remains may well still be buried at Bewley Airfield. The others ended up in the US. I can't work out whether any aircraft were captured by the Soviets. The Mil V-12 looks broadly like the Dragon and uses some similar powertrain concepts, but its development only began in 1959, so it seems highly unlikely that it's a true direct descendant. Fokker-Agellus produced one other helicopter during the war. This was the FA-330. It was a tiny, extremely lightweight rotor kite designed to be carried by Type 9 U-boats for spotting purposes. It wasn't free-flying, but instead was tethered on a 150-metre line to the submarine. Although a good aircraft for its extremely narrowly defined mission, it was quite unpopular with submarine crews. Assembling it on deck exposed the U-boat for too long, and it could not crash dive if it was caught with the hangar open and the helicopter aloft. The FA-330s were therefore used only sporadically. 200 of them were built during the war, and enough survived that they can be found in several major museums. After the war, 3 Flettner 282s were also captured by the Allies. 2 went to the US and 1 to the Soviet Union. In the US, the Prewitt Aircraft Company, who made autogyros, conducted testing on behalf of the industry. The lessons were most obviously taken in by the Kármán Company, who made intermeshing helicopters into the 1950s, including the popular Husky, of which 370 were built. Those continued to serve into the 1970s. And that aircraft was designed by none other than Anton Flettner, who had come to the US in Operation Paperclip during 1947. He died in New York on the 29th of December 1976, aged 76. Henrik Fokker worked in France after the war, then Brazil, before returning to Germany in 1952. He designed helicopters for Borgward and then consulted for various companies before dying in Bremen in February 1979. Fokker and Flettner were not all that instrumental in the development of helicopters worldwide. Other people in other countries shared their vision, and although behind, they soon caught up in the post-war period, admittedly with some lessons learned from the helicopters developed in Germany. But even so, their aircraft deserve to be better remembered as pioneering, if not truly revolutionary.